Well, hi everyone, and hi Alex, thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. Today I'd like to talk to you about a CEO's perspective of risk management. And I'm perhaps not exactly a typical CEO, but for what it is, I've been a risk manager and a CEO, and I think it qualifies me to at least comment on what I saw as the different opinions and the different viewpoints between being a risk manager and being a CEO. I've probably had over 70 different jobs, and I've really just followed my passion. Many times I've landed in a job, and one example, when I went to work at Woodside, I was the manager of security and ambulance services and some of the emergency response communications, and they had just put in a new access control system, the electronic access control system. They just picked up firefighting and they just picked up ambulance service, and I had in the past worked as a security officer, and I worked as a manager in that space, in a general manager's role in Sydney for a sort of multi-million-dollar security company that had been built up. Office work wasn't really what I was aspiring to, but I just seemed to be good at it, and for some reason I like responsibility and a little bit of accountability. So it came to be at Woodside. I actually was just travelling through, as I do, wandering around looking for perhaps a short-term job to fill the bank balance to go travelling, and lo and behold, the security manager was leaving. And somehow I became, through a long story that I've written about elsewhere, that manager. And I remember after a few days after landing the job, I met one of the senior managers at Woodside, and they said, welcome, I looked at your CV, I thought it was perfect. He said, it looks like you knew this job was coming up 5 or 10 years ago and you started studying for it. Because in fact, I'd been a security officer, I'd been a manager in security, I'd been an IT consultant, which fitted with their new access control system. I had also, I was a volunteer ambulance officer and I was a volunteer firefighter. So it was like 5 things that they needed. And I just happened to have embodied that purely because I was doing what I loved doing. It wasn't that I knew this job was coming up, not by a long shot. But my career has progressed through from security to safety management. I did a Master of Risk Management, wrote a book on the security risk management body of knowledge, another book on business cases for risk management. So, that sort of process of learning and growing took me a long way to become, or to join as a founder of a little company called Jakeman Business Solutions, one of the original shareholders. From the get-go, it was just something I liked Miles Jakeman and his attitude and his ethics and the people, and really it was in the early days at least, it was designed to be an opportunity for people who enjoyed each other's company, enjoyed drinking red wine, and wanted to spend more time together, working together. So I became the risk management practice leader there, and I worked there for a number of years. I left after a few years to go overseas to write some books, to live in Phnom Penh and experience Cambodian culture. Partly because writing some more books was part of my goals and dreams, partly because it was good timing and the GFC was coming, and so I said, look, would you mind if I left for a couple of years? That probably helps with our, it's a couple of other people we don't have to let go just to manage, survive through that GFC. So it was a win-win there, and I ended up working in Africa again through a chain of events where I just happened to have these sort of bizarre qualifications that you need to work in remote areas with different cultures and, almost a level of resilience and basic survive in the bush sort of skills. And I remember in the second year of that, we were driving out on a convoy to start a dry season. And I spoke a little bit about this experiences in Africa in another presentation, but I remember Miles was the managing director. By this time, we'd actually bought a few other companies just before I left, and it had become a group, house of brands. And we'd formed the Citadel Group as the managing group. And Miles sent an email to a recruitment agency saying, hi, look, the last CEO we hired didn't work out. We like to advertise for CEO. And he CC'd me, and I just laughed and sent him an email back saying, look, did you send me this because you think I'm a recruitment agency? So I finished the season in Africa and I came back to Australia as the CEO of Jakeman Business Solutions. The largest contract, this was the largest company in the group of $70 million in the Citadel Group. 30 million of that was Jakeman Business Solutions. And the largest single contract in that was actually probably the largest records management system in the Southern Hemisphere. So this is for defence, 250 million records, 30,000 users in any given week. At the same time, we had a consulting arm, and we had a recruiting arm, and we had project arms, and so we did all sorts of things. So this was a yeah, I think, and I'm going to say this quite frankly, almost every single job I've taken has been a push to the next level. And so it's been, much like that duck that swims placidly across the lake, underneath the leaves like this, like crazy sort of thing to get going. And certainly in the start of most of the management jobs I've taken on, I've found myself at different times working 60 and 80-hour weeks just to make the rest of it look like it was very calm and in control, because that's part of the job of a CEO, is to be that leader who says everything's okay, we can make this deadline. I'll talk more about the job of a CEO, but that's how I came to be CEO, and not in any sort of traditional aspiring to be CEO or necessarily growing through the corporate ladder from job to job. To be honest, I've probably quit more perfectly good jobs without having another job to go to than most people will have jobs in their lifetime. I remember turning up to a meeting one day with a 200 horsepower motorcycle, basically a race bike with a registration plate on it. And the CEO of the other company sort of looks at it and just laughs, says, "Oh, you're that kind of CEO." And I think, yes, that, in respect, that sort of sums up. I maybe not completely out there, but I'm a little unusual. About 3 years in a job is about the right time frame for me, because I feel, at least personally, that after 2 to 3 years I've learned 80% of what I'm going to learn, at least in that role. Maybe not in that company, but certainly in that role. I find it 2 years is about the right point to say, okay, I think I've mastered this, at least to the 80% factor, and now I want to go find something else that I know next to nothing about, so that I can, again, be like that mad duck paddling across the pond. For example, I was the Senior Risk Advisor for the Department of Health and Ageing in Australia. I managed risk and property and security for the Australian Trade Commission. I was then the Risk Management Practice Leader for JBS. And in all of these roles, in JBS doing the consulting roles for people like Defence and various other organisations, large government organisations typically, but also some private sector, you're very much thinking about the job of analysing the risk, or building a framework, or building a tool, or maybe communicating it, maybe delivering training. And the job revolves around risk management practices, processes, pretty self-evident, so right. So you spend a lot of time, with risk registers, interviewing people, talking about it, building a beautiful risk management framework that everyone's going to look at and go, that's beautiful, and put it on the shelf, never to be seen again. My first job in government was at the Department of Health and Ageing, and that was my experience, was that you could build a fabulous, well, I thought it was fabulous anyway, my peers thought it was great, a fabulous risk management framework, but unless you can get people to care about it, it's nothing. So a lot of my time was spent presenting, talking to people, negotiating, helping apply, working through risk assessments at that strategic level for various groups. So what's the job of CEO? Well, when you find out, let me know. I'd love to know, to be honest. It's obviously sitting in coffee shops and drinking cappuccinos while all you people do the work for you. The job of a CEO is making decisions, making a lot of decisions, and making them frequently, and hopefully making more good decisions than bad decisions. I think the old adage that a boss of mine used to say, show me a bloke who's never made a mistake and I'll show you someone who's never made a decision. And this I would say to my people as well. I want you to make decisions. So make a decision. If it's wrong, you'll learn something. If it's right, that's great. You can move on. Don't agonise over it. And I follow the same advice. And I think it's about resources. My time as well, obviously, where I spend it with clients doing business development, or whether I spend it with the board, having a relationship there, or perhaps just with my people. And I think, it's very tempting as a CEO to be stuck behind the computer. I mean, not tempting, but often you can be stuck in meetings, you can be stuck behind a screen with emails. People don't judge what you think is important. They don't judge what's important by what you say. They don't judge what's important by what you do. They judge what's important by how you spend your time, and more particularly where you spend your time. So if you spend your time behind the computer doing emails, they will assume that doing emails are more important than they are, doing emails are more important than clients are. So this is the number one decision making. It's not just about when people come to me and say, oh, I need money for a project, or should I do this or that, or can I hire so-and-so or not. It's the question of, how do I personally allocate my time to which people, which projects, and which percentage. And when something's really important to the organisation, that's where you should be spending more time. So that's the risk management of a CEO. And that, for me, is the essence of a job of a CEO, decision making and where you spend your time. So then as a CEO, you think, okay, well, what you come to that new role, and I won't say none of that matters, but as a CEO, it actually didn't matter even to me. Even to me as a risk evangelist who loves risk management, is, monte-carlo, expected value, all this sort of stuff. What I cared about was probably more than anything else was the culture and the people and the systems, and having people that I could trust so that I had the right information. I cared about strategic risks. In fact, the first risk management plan I did, business plan I did as a CEO of JBS. And I might add, from there, when we went to a listed entity, I went to be the divisional manager of Citadel Group, which is largely the same role, but in a bigger listed organisation. And in both cases, going through that, not just client-side facing, but growing the business as part of the senior leadership team to be a listed organisation. The strategic risks, the things that could bite us in the long run, that was what we really cared about. I guess, yes, we cared that we had the right tools, we cared that we had the right risk management framework, but ultimately none of that mattered so much as understanding what our risks were. And I'll leave you with a few thoughts at the end too about practical advice and some sources where you can find out more in depth the sort of things I'm talking about. But it's not really about the processes, it's about the people, and it's about a bit of healthy paranoia, always understanding that things can and will go wrong, and that a 1% chance of something blowing up does not mean a 0% chance. And so you have to have some sort of mitigation idea. You have to have some sort of relationship with the shareholders where you can make sure they are understanding what's going on and make sure they support your actions. You have to have a relationship as a listed company with the stock exchange, with the investors, with the institutions. You have to have a relationship with your clients. Do we have the right clients and the right products, and are we focusing on the right things? And I'll come to the CEO's part of this managing risk in a moment. So culture is very, very much something that as a risk manager I've inculcated as being the most important thing. I'd also say that as a CEO, it's even more important because it's not just about the risk culture, it's about the everything culture. So it's about little things you can do if you want to be practical at a tactical level. You can start each meeting, at least in the people within my organisation, my responsibility, simply said, let's make risk the first agenda item of each meeting. So we can talk about, for example, if there's been any safety incidents. We can talk about project risks. We can talk about economic risks. Do we have enough resources for a particular project? Is a client working well? Are we realising the opportunities? Are they happy with us? Are we happy with them? So all sorts of things within that realm. But to change culture, I found really important, and I've spoken about this many times in other places, but training changes people's behaviours because it gives them new skills and it sets new options and new paths for decision making and understanding that they can use. When their behaviour changes, so do their attitudes. And attitudes change partly because they see the results, partly because that wonderful thing of cognitive dissonance kicks in and they start saying, well, if I'm behaving this way, it must be because it's a better way. So their attitude switches accordingly. And collectively, attitudes, behaviours, values, that is what culture is. And that is one of the ways to manage. I'll give you a couple of tips on where to find out more if you're really curious about this, but that's the simplest approach I've ever found to managing culture. Start with giving people the skills and the knowledge, the why and the how of doing things the way you'd like to do it. It doesn't matter if it's leadership training, risk management training, project management training, anything. I think as a risk manager, I was very much about taking to the senior manager and saying, I have this beautiful framework and I think this will work here and gives the values. As a CEO, even I started to say, look, I don't care. No, I really don't care that much whether the framework is ISO 31000 or COSO. I don't care whether it's something we invented ourselves. I don't care how pretty the slides are. And yes, none of that's irrelevant, and ISO 31000 is the global standard. But far more important is, will this work for us and will this improve our decision making? Will this give me, the CEO, the information I need to make better decisions? Will it give me a sense of confidence that the people who work for me and with me and the people that I answer to have got what they need in order to make a decision. So a little bit, it's objectives, all about objectives. So, there are lots of that. Resources, persistence in achieving those things, but it's just about decision making to achieve objectives. So what's the job of a CEO? It's firstly achieving objectives. You were given some objectives from the shareholders, perhaps the managing director of the group in my case, but within those objectives you have a degree of latitude about how you achieve them. And they're often, in a for-profit organisation, they're often always going to involve profit and the use of funds. They're also going to include questions about safety, about resources, about ethics and values. These are certainly two of the hurdles for me as a business person that I'm always looking at is values. We as Citadel, we would never go into a business arrangement unless the first hurdle was passed, and that was ethics. Do we share the same ethics and values? For me, and this is purely Julian Talbot's view of the world, this is Julian Talbot speaking, I think the job of a CEO is making decisions. And it's that of any senior manager, and you'll be faced, particularly when you have the budget, when you are accountable, you're the person who has to make multiple decisions every day, and you have to make them ideally quickly as you reasonably can, as soon as you have enough information. Colin Powell is one of many people who said if you have less than 30% of the available information, you don't have enough to make a decision. If you have more than 70% of the available information, you probably have too much to make a decision. So there's that point where just enough good quality information to make a decision, and then make the decision, move on. Don't agonise it or dwell on it. If new information comes to light, and I've made mistakes, I've wasted money, I've spent tens of thousands of dollars on projects that didn't pan out, and as soon as we reach a point where we say, that project isn't working out, cut it, move on, accept the new reality, make a new decision. It's called changing your mind, but it's called changing your mind for a good reason, because new information means you should be making a new decision. So that's the job of a CEO, making decisions. Maybe the job of a risk manager is making decisions too, but I think as a risk manager, the job is providing information to senior managers or providing frameworks that other managers can use to make better decisions. So that's perhaps the two differences. If you're a risk manager and you want to get some traction with your CEO, the first thing you need to understand is what they care about, and that's, it's like a good risk manager, that's setting the context. That is the context of this discussion that you're having with your CEO, and it's, I've done it myself as a junior manager where I've had a briefing to senior managers and it's gone well, and I've thrown in one last thing at the end and they've gone, well, actually we don't care about that. So what you need to focus on is objectives, because that's what the CEO focuses on. What are the high-level organisational objectives, and how does risk management support that? How does risk management give a CEO, or more particularly probably all the managers and the team leaders and the staff who manage the risks at the point at which they occur, how does that give them the tools they need? On a board, at one point I was chairman of the board for Citadel, at different times directors of many different for-profit and not-for-profit organisations. Boards have a different role because boards don't generally have an executive role for the most part. Some executive directors certainly do, but a board collectively is designed to provide advice and direction and allocation of resources. It's designed to represent the shareholders. Now, I remember the first time, shortly after I became a CEO of JBS, and it's sort of a, to say $30 million organisation is not huge, but it's nothing to sneeze at either. And so I was given a few months to get my feet under the desk and then come to the board with a 5-year plan. And I did this, I think I did a pretty good plan. It was endorsed by the board, but I used, and this is a learning curve for me, the feedback that I got from the board was it looks like a risk management plan. It's good, we like it, we like what you've done, but it kind of looks like you've just done a risk management plan. And I thought, well, yes, that's what it is. That's, it's a risk management plan. That's exactly what a business plan is, an operational plan, a 5-year strategic plan. It's about threats and opportunities. It's the SWOT analysis. It's about building a series of actionable items and steps that you can use then to develop plan, a result. So, I don't know, I moderated that in future years. I took that to heart. I still used the ISO 31000 framework to look at opportunities and threats, to look at how we would minimise the downside risks, maximise the upside potential, turn all those into benefits so far as we could. But what I presented to the board in format became just the actionable items, just this is our plan, and maybe a bit of commentary about why this came about and where our opportunities are, and how I or we, the team, because none of the CEO stuff is done in isolation. In fact, it's one of the biggest lessons of a CEO or any senior managers. You have to let go, and along the way you say, I need to trust my people and I need to empower them, and my job as a CEO, yes, it's liaising with the board, it's liaising with other senior leaders, it's liaising with other organisations, with clients, it's having those relationships, doing some business development. I could go on, and the job of a CEO is either does all those or is accountable for all of those, or both. But ultimately, the job of a CEO is just making sure that I gave enough resources, the right resources at the right time in the right quantity to the right people. And budgets are finite. Using risk management and advice from my risk managers was all about saying, do I have the right amount of information to understand where to put resources? So that's that point I came back to. Decision making, it's just optimizing the allocation of resources. And if that sounds like risk management, that's because it's exactly what it is. So that's kind of the dealing with boards part. Speak their language and come back to them in a way that makes sense for them as shareholders and gives them some assurance. Boards usually have audit and risk committees, and through that mechanism they want to understand that what you're doing reflects the real world, that you understand the risks that you're managing, but above all that you are working the plan you said you would and achieving the objectives that they've asked you to achieve. So again, speaking their language, that's a big part of being going from a risk manager to a CEO. And indeed, for any manager, for a risk manager or a general manager or mid-level manager, it's speaking the same language, using the same tools that you use elsewhere. Top 10 tips, if you like, for risk management for CEOs. So if you're becoming a CEO as a risk manager, or if you are a C-suite manager at any level and you're interested in risk management, here's my top 10 tips for what they're worth. So firstly, it's the 21st century, and just recognise that although the world is getting better by almost every metric we can think about, it's also getting far more complex and volatile. You only have to look at the stock market in the last few years to see volatility in action, but climate change, weather change, artificial intelligence, genetics, nanotechnology, robotics, and indeed the ultimate artificial general intelligence, which potentially will even replace humans in many of our roles, is becoming more complex. So risk is actually becoming more sophisticated, and you need to be thinking about it in ways that reflect that. There's no point looking for simple tools like a risk matrix to solve these, because it's better to think about causation and causal chains and downstream impacts. Understanding biases. We have so many human biases. Now, there's a great book on this topic, Thinking Fast and Slow, by Daniel Kahneman, probably the best behavioural psychologist, arguably, of the 20th century. I defy anybody to read this book and see themselves or the world the same way. So, put this on one of your top reading lists if you haven't read it already, Thinking Fast and Slow, and I'll put it up in a moment so you can copy it down and a link to it. We see the world through our own biases, and we see risk through our own biases. And, a simple example is this anchoring bias. If you ask someone to estimate the probability of something happening, but before you ask them to do that, you ask them to write down their telephone number, a large 6, 8, 10-digit number, as versus a small number between 1 and 10. And you do this with 1,000 people, and 500, you ask them to recite their telephone number first, and 500 you ask them to pick a number between 1 and 10 first. And invariably, the statistics will show that we have, for no good reason, we have an anchoring bias, that the group who quoted a number between 1 and 10 will give a lower probability of risk than the ones who gave their phone number first. So it's bonkers, I know, but we have these biases inbuilt. So be a little paranoid about your own blind spots. You know, I go through life, I've learned I'm constantly on the lookout for my blind spots. And it's a matter of great satisfaction when I do find them. But of course, by definition, the ones I don't see at the moment are still affecting my life in invisible ways. So another is that sense of paranoia. Don't let any threat be below your threshold of concern. And I don't mean you have to put every threat to the business or the organisation on a register somewhere, but if it comes up in conversation, think about it. Give it a moment, because everything can potentially affect you, and at some point it's better to have a register of threats or a register of risks. And indeed, I would argue perhaps that a register of risks is just a simple list of the things that could go wrong, the sources of risk, potential hazards, and not all of them might need listing on a risk register or incorporation into any detailed analysis, but it's unwise in the 21st century to ignore any threat. And here's something I see lacking in a lot of organisations, and that is to define the risk attitude and risk tolerance. And I don't mean to do it just with a simple table, at the bottom of a risk matrix or some sort of conversation, but to be explicit, really explicit, so that anybody could pick it up and understand what is as an organisation, what is our risk attitude and what's our tolerance, because it's very different if you think about a startup. The risk tolerance for a startup is almost 100%. It's a make or break. You can accept complete loss of the business and move on to a new startup. But when you're the size of General Electric, you really are taking smaller risks. You really got to face a different risk tolerance. And yes, at an organisational level, you can afford much bigger risks, but as a potential or as a percentage of all the enterprise size, you don't want catastrophic risk, because they truly are of a billions of dollars of magnitude. So a very, very different perspective on how you might take risk. Now, I'm not saying General Electric can probably afford to take much more risk than a startup in some respects, but defining that as part of a small project or a small team unit or a small development R&D project, is doing that explicitly is so important. Anytime you have a near miss, anything that goes wrong, don't wait for it to be a catastrophe or a realised risk. Do a detailed root cause analysis on your, and I've got some templates for this on my website, so juliantalbot.com, come and have a look if you like. But do the root cause analysis of a near miss, and you'll identify the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities, the causal chains that could go wrong here. And it gives you a chance to head them off at the pass. It gives you a chance to make your enterprise, your business, what Talbot would call anti-fragile. So this idea of anti-fragile or anti-fragility is that if something goes wrong, you can potentially even come back stronger from it. It can actually make you more resilient and stronger. And I would say part of being anti-fragile is part of being understanding root causes and potential causes of near misses, not just incidents. So long-term thinking, we see the quarterly profit cycle, we see all sorts of, if you could trace back the global financial crisis to, I don't think you could trace it back to any one thing, but I think you could trace it back largely to incentives, and particularly short-term incentives for corporations and salespeople who were just making bonuses and quarterly performance bonuses by selling products which ultimately they knew were not legitimately viable products, were not sustainable. And a little bit, you can see at the end there, it wasn't just the wise people. Most people working on Wall Street or in finance could see that the quality of bonds was going downhill, but nobody wanted to be the first person to get out. While the tide was rising, everybody wanted to make bonus. And they did, and we saw the calamity, but the incentives will drive performance and will drive behaviours. So think long term if you're thinking about incentivising your people, at least annual bonuses, if not some sort of long tail. So maybe on a bonus criteria, there's a 50% now, 25% the next year, 25% the year after that, and create that long tail which aligns people's incentives. And again, investing, don't invest in short-term projects when you can invest in long-term projects. Think about how an extra 10% on the cost of a project might sustain you over 5 years rather than over 2 years. Greed is good, but paranoia is better. I think Gordon Gekko said, yes, greed is good, and I can't really argue with that. There are some ways in which greed can be very good. But if you read Managing the Unexpected by Carl Week and Kathleen Sutcliffe, you'll understand that organisations like nuclear power plants, air traffic control, aircraft carriers, all of which sort of fall into this group of what they call high reliability organisations, constantly deal with a level of risk. Landing a 40,000-pound jet aircraft on the deck of a moving carrier at night in a 30-knot wind when the plane itself is loaded with explosives, and things can constantly go wrong, and yet they rarely do. And one of the reasons, two reasons, one of the reasons that they, 5 reasons, sorry, if you read the book you'll see the full 5 reasons, but managing risk at the point at which it occurs, but above all having a healthy sense of paranoia that we are only one step away from disaster. And I mean that in a healthy sense. Andy Grove wrote a book, Only the Paranoid Survive. I'm not paranoid, but I have this constant sense that I'm not immortal and I'm not infallible, and stuff can go wrong. There's another presentation that I've yet to do at some point talking about interconnectedness. I think there's even a book in this. And I look at the risk world that we're in now, and we have these ideas that we have financial risk, and we have maybe derivatives, we have safety risk, we have operational risk, there's engineering risk, we can talk about security, we can talk about technology, all these risks. And often people work as practitioners. Maybe they work as academics in a university researching things, and maybe they're construction engineers working and managing those sort of risks. Maybe they're project managers looking at these risks. Increasingly, we are so interconnected. It's the classic, the flapping of the wings of a butterfly in the Amazon rainforest causing a hurricane. If you think a simple example of hackers, cybersecurity, artificial general intelligence, electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, supply lines, and our cities, and how much food we have in our cities, you only have to think that there are so many areas of fragility built into this system, which is robust in the broad sense, but nothing we do as a CEO or as a business person or a manager is isolated from any of these supply chains or any of these connections. And particularly in the world of the Internet of Things, it's all connected and becoming more so. So, this is just big picture thinking taken to the nth degree. You can't just be good at running a factory. You've got to be good at understanding how the factory connects into the broader world. So thought. And now, you've mostly heard of black swans. Well, I also like to talk about white swans and brindle swans. So these black, white, and multicoloured swans. Now, black swans, Nassim Taleb coined the phrase originally in his book, Fooled by Randomness, which, for my money, I think was actually slightly better than the Black Swan book. So, but it was a chapter in that book, and he spoke about this idea of things which look like they're foreseeable in hindsight, but actually come out of the blue, and until you've seen a black swan, you wouldn't anticipate it. It comes from the logic argument, where originally all the swans that we knew about in Europe hundreds of years ago were white, until the first people came to, the first Europeans came to Western Australia, and they discovered black swans. Now, we can't say there are no red swans or green swans or what have you in the world, but the idea of a black swan is that there may be red swans. 9/11, other events, and I won't say they're unpredictable, because we can, but at the same level we can predict a meteorite strike. White swans are things which we could be major catastrophes for us, but which we could also reasonably foresee. We know there are white swans in the world. We know there are things. New competitors can take our business and turn it to nothing. We can make a strategic decision like Kodak did. They invented the first digital camera, and then they stopped developing it. And Kodak, from being a household name, is now a footnote in history. So, that was a white swan, really, and it should have been a white swan for them. But my proposition is that we need to think about black swans, white swans, and multicoloured swans, some which we can't foresee, but we still need to have the all hazards approach, some which we can foresee, and we should have them very high on our radar for monitoring and treating. And then there's the brindle, multicoloured, brown and odd sorts coloured swans, which maybe we can think about, and we can anticipate the broader concept of things which could go wrong. Now, last but not least, I would say, just train and nurture and develop and identify the next generation of risk managers. And, CEO's perspective, I'd say do this for all your managers. You need to nurture the high potential people there. You need to find the next CEO. And your job, in my view at least, anytime I've had a job as a manager, part of my role was to make myself redundant. Because, I hear people say, oh, well, I'm indispensable. Or at least they think I'm indispensable. And, I think the last time I said to someone who said, oh, well, I can't go on holidays, this project, I'm indispensable. My response to them was perhaps a little bit blunt, but I said, look, let me go down the road and I'll show you a cemetery full of indispensable people. Everybody at some point becomes dispensable or becomes replaceable. So don't make yourself indispensable, go the opposite way. And in fact, you can't be promoted until you've found a replacement. If you're indispensable, you'll never get out of that job, you'll never be promoted. So train and nurture that next generation. So here are some of the books that I'd recommend. Daniel Kahneman's Thinking, Fast and Slow. Fantastic, groundbreaking. Week and Sutcliffe's Managing the Unexpected, a great intro to high reliability organisations, to HROs, and concepts of what make things like aircraft carriers safer places to work than most offices. Robert Cialdini wrote a great book called Influence, which should be on everybody's reading list, but I think Persuasion, his next book, is even better. And again, like Thinking Fast and Slow, I defy you to see the world the same way, or even to see yourself the same way after reading this book. Nudge by Thaler and Sunstein is another great book. Just that whole idea, very similar to the concepts in Persuasion, but I think more accessible perhaps. Kunretha and Usaim's, I hope I pronounced those correctly, book on mastering catastrophic risk is recently out. It's definitely worth a look, especially for CEOs and understanding from the business point of view what can go on. Max Bazerman's The Power of Noticing, and I could probably go on with a whole host of other books, but I think they are really important for CEOs and risk managers to read and understand. So you'll note none of those are specifically risk management books. I'm not pointing you towards Against the Gods or Adams's book on risk or a whole bunch of other great books about risk management, decision making. Scott Plouse on decision making. You could go on and on. But Thinking Fast and Slow, number one, Persuasion, number two, and then the rest sum up, I think, for me, what a CEO needs to know about risk management. And you'll see if you've been focusing as a risk manager on risk frameworks and what have you, you'll see a very different view. So thank you. That's enough from me. That's covered it there. If you like this or you'd like to know more, please feel free to get in touch. You can find me on LinkedIn. Every day I post a couple of articles that I think are interesting, that are worth sharing in my feed there at LinkedIn. You'll also find at juliantalbot.com. Feel free to drop me a line. I would love to hear from you. Part of my joy in life is having interesting discussions and trying to evolve these ideas of risk. So thanks very much, and bye for now.